Okay, we're live now.
Sorry.
Sorry, people. Can you hear me? Okay, so I've got.
Yeah. Have you started us?
Yes. We were just. I was just trying to dive in at our two wonderful guests here, having a discussion about tree points. So we'll talk more about that later. So, welcome to round 3 of our rather provocative rigid versus treeless saddles discussion. And again, we have our two leading saddle design innovators, Maria Hallring from ErgoX2 Saddles of Sweden and Bradley Whale from Ipotane Saddles in the UK. And he's the provocative one. I'm Caroline Lindsay, President of the Professional Saddle Fitters Association, and currently halfway through a professional doctorate based on rider posture, pain, and performance. And I just want to quickly say that it's wonderful to see so many posts on the many topics I've been banging on about for at least 7 years now about the horse, saddles, riders, how riders can help horses, why development tack is detrimental to gait, and how we need to change saddle fitting protocol. So keep up the good work, everyone. We are getting there. So if you have any comments, just put them in, just write them, and I'll come back to them at intervals. And Bradley will present the remainder of his slides from the last session first. So away you go, Bradley.
Right, you're gonna have to let me in.
I don't have a presentation to let in yet.
No, that's not that one.
It's coming up. No, wrong one.
That was the wrong one. No, hang on. Where is it? Share screen. I've got to find the right presentation because I've got about 6. There it is.
Only 6?
Yeah, no.
On the go, probably.
Yeah. Right, can we see that one?
25 in my
Oh, yes. Yes, sorry. At the stage. Okay. Lovely.
Right. Hello, everybody. Right, so I apologise. This is part 3, and this is kind of an extension of what I was talking about last time, talking primarily about hybrid saddles. But at the latter end, I wanted to start kind of talking about saddle fitting in terms of treed saddles, treeless saddles, and hybrids. So what I very much want to kind of put across is, at the moment, we're very we have 2 options, treed or treeless, or the position of a hybrid saddle, which is in the middle. And what I really want to kind of get people to understand is that we have a potential within the industry to really go forward, that we really can start, to put it bluntly, essentially have a saddle space race, a real progression within the industry. And we're kind of right at that crux where we can do that. So very much there are a huge amount of possibilities, but in order to have those unlimited possibilities, we almost need to come back and actually start looking at the industry, what we say as shoshin, which is a Japanese word for beginner's mind. So it's a beginner's mindset. So you've got to come in and you've got to start questioning the very basics, from the very basic concepts of how we fit a saddle, to the reasons why, to, even the materials. So that's where very much I look at things, and where we kind of look at things with people and the company which I work for. So as I said, saddles have a variety of functions. They are limited in how they perform, but they also fulfill a very positive role, for whatever role that is, treed or treeless. But it's not about kind of whether it's treed or treeless, what we're actually looking at is how do you balance it? You know, how do we balance this proverbial product onto the horse? You know, if we break down treed and treeless into two fundamental concepts, which are structure and function or flexibility, and look at those as scales, then what we're ideally looking for is this kind of balance, this marriage, this harmonious marriage between balance, or this between structure and flexibility. So how do we balance that? Now, my argument is, and I am slightly biased because obviously I am a hybrid saddle manufacturer, but I will always kind of go, well, hybrid saddles do have a viable option within the industry. But they are an option, but they are the beginning. That is the fledgling part of this third category. And that's why I say is that with the third category, the opportunities to really break the rules and to really kind of create something is kind of really, really, really exciting. Well, I think it is anyway. So we come back to one of Caroline's questions, which she always puts out towards the industry, which is, okay, what do riders and fitters need to know about selecting saddles? And that's a really important question. But before we even start looking at the different saddles like treed and treeless, we need to basically look and see how saddles interact with both athletes. Now, that's been written about, that's been talked about a huge amount of times in terms of the anatomy and the physiology. And that will continue to happen, because the greater knowledge we have, the more in depth we'll go, which means that the better the industry will become in terms of knowledge. But that needs to be transferred into the products. And at the moment, we don't have that kind of transference element of the knowledge being transferred into products just yet. Now, I know Maria is, I certainly am. We're doing some very weird stuff behind closed doors, which is hilarious. Some of our little secret projects which we have on is just great fun. But the difficulty is that in order to start talking about what do riders and fitters need to know about selecting saddles, we fundamentally need to create a concept. We need to create a theory or a model in order to kind of create a universal language which we can all understand. So here's concepts and conceptual models or principles which other industries use. Okay, so for example, I'm using principles of osteopathy because I'm an osteopath, and that was my first qualification, so I'm very loyal towards osteopathy. So we have the 4 principles of osteopathy, which is human being as a dynamic functional unit, whose state of health is influenced by body, mind, and spirit. Number 2, the body possesses self-regulatory mechanisms, and it is able to naturally self-heal. Number 3, structure and function are interrelated at all levels of the human body. And then, because it's osteopathy, rule of the artery is supreme. So blood supply is more important. Now, you could change those principles of osteopathy into principles of chiropractic. And principles of chiropractic would have something which is very, very similar, which is not a problem, but their 4th rule or their 4th principle would be rule of the nerve is supreme. So that consequently, chiropractors believe that nerve supply is more important than other areas. It's not saying that one is better than the other. It is saying that we look at things from a different conceptual model. Now, we as an industry, we don't have conceptual models, and that is the problem. If you don't have a conceptual model which everyone can understand and utilize, then it creates a huge amount of conflict within the industry. And that is where we start kind of and that's what we've inadvertently created within the saddle industry at the moment. We have subconsciously created a system which is quite argumentative, when actually we need to create a conceptual model. And we have these models, like models of treatment. So models of treatment: mechanical model, neurological, respiratory, metabolic, and biopsychosocial. Now, you don't use all of those models when you're treating a horse or you're treating a human. You're utilizing your principles in order to utilize the best model of treatment in order to help that client and that individual in front of you. So that gives you an understanding of what other industries have done. And now what we're going to do is basically show a conceptual model which I created. And you may turn around and go, well, it's very convenient that you've kind of talking about conceptual models. But the difficulty is I've been doing Ipotane and saddlery behind closed doors for a number of years. And these conceptual models, because there is nothing within the industry to work from. There is no foundation conceptual model to understand. You have to understand that almost every product works differently, that every single, and you're suddenly going, well, there's at least 100 different saddles with 100 different theories and concepts of how they should fit and everything like that. There is nothing which is a universal language or nothing which is a universal concept. In osteopathy, we can turn around and go structure governs function, or structure and function are interrelated. That is a conceptual model or a principle which can be applied to physiotherapy, chiropractic, osteopathy, acupuncture, reflexology, Bowen therapy, a myriad of different therapies. So it's a universal model which can spread quite thin across all kind of treatment models. So what I went off and did was basically, and I've taken about 2 years to create this on and off, because I have various kind of super secret projects which I work on. And one of them is to try and create a conceptual model for the saddle industry. So this is basically what I did. Now, the difficulty is we couldn't actually create a singular conceptual model which would theoretically work for the extremes of treed saddles and the extreme of treeless saddles. So therefore, and also then the rider and the horse. So we couldn't, you couldn't create a model or a concept which kind of helped and uniformly explained the whole industry or the potential from one extreme to the other. So in order to do that, we had to create 2 different conceptual models, which are under an umbrella terminology, which is what we created is the puppeteer concept, or the puppeteer concept model. And it's the reasons why we talk about this is because it's a way to interpret and consider all of the forces and influences on any saddle type. So from treed to treeless, and it allows you to then go deeper. So you have what we call glove puppet. So these are the forces which go from below, which affect the saddle. So you imagine the saddle now sat on top of the horse, and you've got all of the forces which come up underneath and affecting the saddle. So such as the movement of the horse, kind of the ground, the angle of the ground, the positioning of the ground. You know, is it arena or is it out on a unlevel surface? Talking about foot balance or the influences of foot balance, leg lengths, even forces such as girthing up, which is a compressive force. All interact and are basically what we call glove puppets. So it's all forces which are coming up and affecting the saddle. So it's always the saddle's kind of sat on top of the horse. So it's everything which is underneath. We then have puppet string, which is the exact opposite. It's all the forces coming from above. So you suddenly have all of the influences above, which is including the rider, the anatomy of the rider, the psychology of the rider, the movement pattern of the rider. You then have gravity. You have weight. Weight is more important in terms of puppet string, so the superior or the influences coming down, than it is necessarily in terms with glove puppet and the forces coming from below. So this allows us then to suddenly break the saddle down into 2 components, above and below, and we can start turning around and utilizing this concept in order to help break down and identify subsequent issues with products or with a fitting process. Now, conceptual models and their use they're not designed to be restrictive. In fact, they're designed to actually create a foundation stone for the industry. They're designed to create a universal language. You know, we've all been on forums where people have started to talk about a poor saddle fitting or a poor product or anything like that. And you suddenly have to ask more questions in terms of how, why, is it a problem with the horse? Have you done this? Have you done that? Have you put the saddle on and just lunged the horse? Have you then put the rider on top? Have you looked at the stirrup bars? Have you looked at the rider's mechanics? Have you looked at how strong or weak is the rider? All of these things. Now, the idea behind those conceptual models is to help break that process down a lot easier for the industry. They're also primarily designed to be built upon. So, for example, I can say about glove puppet or puppet string, and then someone like Maria or any other kind of high industry professional can turn around and go, well, you haven't included time, or you haven't included this, or you haven't included that. And go, brilliant, well, add it in, you know, create another conceptual model which works, as well as, you know, it's the whole idea of conceptual models is just to create a universal language and a foundation stone so that other kind of people can build and improve the product or improve the industry as a whole. And actually, the reasons why we have conceptual models is to also break down the sheer complexity of what we know into a very simplistic language and a very simplistic concept for a customer. So when you are looking at a horse perform and ride and so on and so forth, you can turn around to a customer and going, right, and here I am looking at how the rider interacts with the saddle. I am not looking at how the horse and the rider and the saddle interact with the ground and the foot balance, and all. It becomes too complicated and you will lose customers. The idea is that suddenly you can turn around and go to a customer and go, right, here we are just looking at how the saddle interacts with the horse. And then we're going to look at how the saddle interacts or the rider interacts with the saddle. And then we're going to basically then put it all together. So it's a very basic conceptual model for the industry. Then what we also get asked is there a formula? And Caroline's asked this, you know, is there a protocol? Is there a way of kind of working out at how a formula can kind of link rider types and saddle types? And I'm going to be going out on a limb on this one and saying, actually, yes, there is, because that's what I spent about 3 years creating. And that's the reasons why, in some regards, it's the controversial element of me turning around and saying about measurements. Because we do a lot of objective measurements. And in order to create this formula, and I will absolutely tell you right now, I can't show you the formula because that is our intellectual property, and so on and so forth. But I will be showing you certain things which we do behind the scenes in order to explain the reasons why we ask for measurements and various things like that. So in order to create this formula, we had to break the rules. And you'll realize with me is that I'm quite fun at breaking rules. I understand and I respect the rules, but then we also need to look at things and how we can marry modern technology with traditional kind of elements of the industry. And the idea is that we are also then proactive rather than being reactionary. So we want to create a system and a process for the industry that a saddle fitter can go out preemptively. And the only way you're going to do that is by taking objective measurements.
Bradley, when we're talking about the rules,
yeah,
I don't even know what they are because I'm not English. I've certainly probably broke most of them, and I think that there are a few designers, apart from you and me, who have gone into saddleries and asked to break the rules, and the problem has been probably that the crafts people thought that we were completely idiots and didn't know what we were talking about because we wanted
Yes.
to do something different. So the rules you're talking about, they are more what people are used, how they are used to make things and what they are used to use when they make things.
Yes.
So,
and that's what I mean is those are rules. You know, for example, you know, one of the big things is putting a stirrup bar further forward. And there are times and places to put a stirrup bar further forward. Of course, there are. But in order to put a stirrup bar further forward, you have to create stability in order to allow that stirrup bar to be placed there, because you're putting through a force of a rider which is about double or triple their weight value.
Yeah.
So therefore, you need a rigid structure, and that then lends itself to needing a rigid gullet bar. You need a rigid gullet bar in order to affix a rigid stirrup bar, because you're going further forward. Now, the reasons why you putting the stirrup bars further forward, well, it creates a wider or a larger area of balance. If you bring the stirrup bar further back, then you are creating a balance point which is much smaller. It's not saying that it's necessarily bad or good. What it's saying is, if you are going to do one thing, you are going to tip the scales back in the other direction. You are going to you cause and effect.
Yeah, and with the shorter stirrup bar, we found, because we've been playing with the stirrup bar all over the place for a couple of years, that certain pelvises and certain size of people, taller people, bigger feet, people with long legs who are jumping quite high, they will tend to want to rise up, can go much further forward. They actually go over the pommel when they go to 160, and they will want a shorter stirrup bar. And then we're talking a lot of weight, because these riders are a little bit bigger and a little bit taller, and they move further forward.
Yeah,
we talk shorter riders.
And that's the thing, is you're not only talking necessarily about where the stirrup bar is positioned forward and backwards, but also in terms of height. Now, is it right that a stirrup bar should be quite high or stirrup bar should be positioned quite low? That then has a knock-on effect in terms of the length of the stirrup leather. And because the length of the stirrup leather has an influence on the body positioning, because if you've got a longer lever and a longer flexible stirrup leather, then you have to have greater balance. If you have a shorter stirrup leather, then all of a sudden you don't have to be so strong. You can be a little bit weaker. So, and all of these factors we have to take into consideration, which is quite fascinating.
Yeah.
And that's why I say is you have an industry which has preset rules, and that's where, as I say, someone like yourself and someone like myself comes in and goes, well, okay, anatomically that doesn't make sense, and physics, you can manipulate it in other ways to get more out of it. Caroline,
can I just ask a question? Might seem a bit odd, but why do we have to have a stirrup bar? Why can't the stirrup leather be attached to the flap?
So there are saddles which do that. So Western saddles would typically have a leather strap which goes over the entirety of the horse's back. There are some saddles which attach the stirrup leathers to the flap, to the saddle flap. That means that then the forces which attach the flap to the tree have to be quite hard and quite rigid. So because what you're doing is making the flap a structural component of the product, if you see what I mean.
I think the biggest problem here is that you need to have the stirrup bar actually quite close to your own moving part to make it work with you when you get up. Because if you move it down this much, that stirrup leather is not going to be moving like your body moves. Are you with me? So your lever is starting up at the hip.
Yeah.
Your movement is starting up at the hip, and then if you attach something here, it's not going to be syncing at all with how you move. So it's going to be really hard to move and ride unless you sit very still.
It very much depends. Yes, but it very much depends on the style of which you ride and the discipline which you are riding in. So if you're doing jumping, absolutely. The other factor, going back to Caroline, if you created the flap as suddenly a structural component, the benefit of that is that suddenly the saddle flap is now taking on the entirety of the load. So you're suddenly, instead of spreading the load over a stirrup bar length, you are then suddenly spreading it over the flap length, if you see what I mean. Because the flap has a greater attachment zone or area to the tree or to the main structure of the product. So if it's a treeless saddle, you suddenly the flap is taking a load and it's spread, and you're spreading that load. It's how you dissipate load is by spreading it. But you've got to be clever, because force is spread at roughly, and I'm only saying this roughly because it depends on materials and various things like that, but force is roughly spread at a 45-degree angle from the point of force. Now that is changed in terms of the different materials which you utilize.
I ask the question because it's one of the big problems with treeless flexible saddles, that this pressure, and because rigid saddles, you can put a stirrup bar on them and it will be distributed, but either way the weight is not distributed enough.
Yeah, but the funny thing is you look at all of the testing process which they do for pressure. Where do they put the pressure pad? On the horse's back, correct?
Yeah.
On top of the numna or underneath the numna? Generally on top of the numna, not underneath the numna. So the numna, this is where it becomes slightly interesting, is because when you do a pressure loading test with a pressure pad on top of the numna, you get this very distinct pattern of where the panels are. When you take the panel off, take the pressure mat off, and you actually put it underneath the horse or onto the horse's back, and you put a numna over the top and then the panel, you have something which occurs, which is what we call numna spread. So the numna, and we've all seen it, where a numna, it starts off really high, and then what happens is it gradually comes down and it starts to spread. Now, all of a sudden, that cloth, that material, is now spreading a constant load over the entirety of the horse's back. This is where it becomes quite interesting when you are looking at people who are talking about channel widths, and you sit there and go, right, put the pressure mat underneath the horse's back, underneath the numna, on top of the horse's back, and see what the numna does after 20 minutes or half an hour of riding. Because the numna then starts actually slipping down and spreading and becomes a force distributor. And this is the problem within the industry, is that you have testing process which isn't taking in certain components. Every test which I've seen by major kind of testing houses or equestrian testing houses put the pressure mat on top of the numna, because they're trying to test the panel, which is absolutely correct and true, but you have suddenly just missed this piece of cloth, which is also then in contact with the horse and does have some load bearing capacity and force spreading capacity. And it's not calculated. It's not included within the testing process.
Interesting. So we have got quite a long way to go with all this, especially when we're demanding more research and more scientific answers. The other reason I asked about attaching the stirrups to the saddle flap was many years ago, probably about 30, my instructor at the time took a piece of baler twine and attached my stirrup, or a part of my stirrup, to the girth in the days where we did health and safety.
You could legally do that, yes.
Oh, can we?
No, you can't do it now. You used to be able to do it, yeah. I know what you mean. My horse never cantered so well. Yeah.
And he was a difficult horse, but he was so relaxed, because obviously my legs were tied to the to the stirrups in effect, or to the girth. But I was absolutely astonished at how well my horse moved when my feet didn't.
Yes, exactly.
So,
This is why when you're talking about, if you are positioning a stirrup bar, you have to be mindful not only in terms of forward backwards, but also in terms of height. You also have to be aware is that if you have, like on girth straps, and this is something which we've kind of played around with stirrup bar straps or stirrup bars, is you got girth strapping, which is kind of, you know, the V web and the W web and so on and so forth, to try and keep the saddle as stable as possible. And you sit there and go, well, you can do exactly the same thing for stirrup bars, because if you are trying to spread the load of the rider across the entirety of the length of the tree, that is going to stabilize the rider like that.
You can just take thin island things like this, start from there to here, and you just put the D in the middle.
Yeah. Yep. And Western saddles do that. You know, these things already exist. It's just, you've got to remember is that the modern European saddle or English style saddle is a perversion, as I've talked about earlier. You know, the history of saddles and the progression of the evolution of saddles. That they have, what we have now is a hyper specialized perversion of what a saddle is truly supposed to do 200 years ago. And we have picked up bits and pieces, and it's not, you know, it's a mishmash of whether it works for the horse or whether it works for the rider. But by keeping the rider stable, now that also creates a conundrum, because if you hyper stabilize the rider, are you actually doing the rider any benefit? So are you actually, by being really nice and stabilizing the rider, are you actually making them dependent and actually less stable in another format?
Can I answer some of that? Because we have been playing with that for 7 years now, because there are several points in the body of the rider that you can help to stabilize, from the pelvis to the hip hinge, not pushing the pelvis in any direction, to the way the thighs fall, how wide it is under the thigh, to what kind of support you have under the calf, to where the foot ends up underneath the rider to be aligned with the rider.
And even things like ankle flexibility and foot shape and foot position, that also has influence as well.
And
so,
you know, just getting the inside of the foot actually having really, really good contact. And we have seen, you know, we may have, like, interesting what you said with the foot, because we may have done all the other 5 things, if we say that there are 5 things. And then there's been a lack of contact on the inside of the foot of the rider, and the horse is still schlepping along, you know, not looking specifically, you know, interesting. We put a wedge underneath the foot, inside of the foot of the rider. She starts trotting again, and suddenly the horse is bouncing off the ground, completely stable, looking like a perfect 4-wheel drive. The hard thing is, if riders are used to move back and forward, for them to, because you can't close them in, they kind of have to find the balance in there. So their brain is still programmed to move and to have that support or the knee block in front. So they will feel somewhat lost for about 10 days, some of them, if they have been dependent on that, because they need to use their core. But for the horse, I mean, the first time I tested this in 2004, we found that the horses really reacted the best to the rider moving less. That was a profound thing for us to see, that the horse really appreciates the rider not being all over the place, but for the rider actually to ride on that, like you said, that shorter area, to be moving more upward instead of down and forward all the time. That's you know, takes a little bit of reprogramming of muscles and how you move. So for some riders it will not work, because they need to sit a little bit behind. They are either physically unable to or a bit scared, because if you force them forward and up, it opens their chest up. And if you talk about the Feldenkrais, first time I showed my saddles, I had a Feldenkrais therapist come in, and she sat in one of them, and it was a little bit wide, so she was still slightly posterior. So she was like, okay, I'm still a bit closed in my chest. She went to the next one where she came up, and she says, oh, now I'm open and ready for the world. And this is what she's also transferring to the horse.
Yeah.
And so it's very, very interesting how the rider's body language and stability has a direct effect on the horse. It's super cool.
Yeah.
And what I would like to add to that is from my perspective and all my research and the way I've been working for years and years, is that stability is key, and we need stability to synchronize, and that's what the research is telling us. But because there are so many, 80+% of riders are in pain when they ride, and if we have more stability, obviously without bounce, if we have more stability, then we have potential to reduce musculoskeletal strain.
Yeah, you also have the potential that you are inadvertently making them weaker. I'm playing devil's advocate. Okay, in this situation, in what you're saying, so I'm going to say right now, I agree with you, but I'm going to play devil's advocate. It's very much, it's like when I have clients where you sit there and you kind of go, right, I'm going to give you orthotics so that you can have a more structure in terms of knee alignment and so on and so forth. The problem is then people will rely on a passive product to do the work, rather than actually turning around and going, well, actually, you can do the same thing by doing certain exercises with your feet and your arches and your calf muscles and so on and so forth. So you then have to have a discussion with the customer and kind of go, right, do you want a product which is passive, you can put in your shoe, you can do this, that, and the other, or do you actually want to be active? And that's where it's almost like a morality question and an ethics question. You kind of have to kind of go, right, where do you want to go as a customer? Do you want to work, get strong, or do you want to have passive products which will position you in the right position and kind of balance you and so on and so forth, but you will be inherently weaker because of that? There is an argument to be had where actually there's a very good middle ground to be had, and that's taking the side of more rehabilitation. And in terms of you go on a journey with the client and the customer, and you someone to say, right, at the beginning, we're going to over pacify, we're going to give you too many passive products, and we're going to position you right so you get used to it and you're balanced and so on and so forth. But this is the contract. You've got to do the hard work. You've got to go off and do the core stability, blah, 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 blah. And there is a way of doing that. But again, this is an over stylized, beautiful version of reality, which is not real.
We cannot do that. But there's a twist to this, because the saddle only helps them to be neutral. It doesn't position them passively anywhere.
Yeah.
So they actually have to become more core strong.
Yeah.
So in a way, yeah, because they're not using their big global muscles to stabilize themselves anymore.
Yep.
They will not have to use their big muscles. They won't sweat as much when they ride the way we position them. I have dressage riders say, oh, this feels like a walk in the park. The question is she weaker because of that? No, because she can't ride that saddle unless she trains the other muscles, her core, because she can't maintain that position without her core. The interesting thing for us was that we found that a rider who is in a posterior position, it doesn't really matter how much they train their core, they can't really access it.
Yeah.
So they are using a lot of compensation muscle to try to stabilize. And we can basically just put them posterior and almost push them off a buck just by just give them a little whiff like that, and they're all over the place. Once they're in neutral, you do the same thing, and they are rock solid. And and we didn't expect that. We didn't expect that to be the effect. So it's like, yeah, their global muscles will be weaker, but their core muscles. And I've had, I don't know how many ladies that have come back to me and said, I felt very insecure for about 10 days. I thought I was going to fall off because the saddle wasn't there and I couldn't use my normal muscles. And then after 10 days, when I found my other muscles and they started to work and my body knew what it was doing, I felt the horse could throw itself wherever, all because I was just in the middle. It was so easy for me to follow. And you know, being in the center of the motion is like a ballet dancer, I guess. If you have that help to actually be toned so that you're ready for whatever is coming, which you can't be in posterior or anterior, because you're switched off. And exactly. we never expected that when we started working. So we kept getting surprised, and then we had to ask, what is going on? What is happening? Why are we able, you know, why do riders react this way? And why do horses react to the rider this way? So I had to work backwards.
Yeah.
Because I was constantly surprised.
Yeah.
I think the one of the big problems is that we still don't know how riders ride.
Yeah.
A lot of the research looks at elite riders because that's a group with less variables, but most of them are in pain, have joint problems, and you know, who rides like an elite rider? And so there is still a lot of variability in riders, so it's difficult to get the truth. But we don't know how riders ride. Yes, we know how they perhaps should ride, but it's difficult because I think the way the horse reacts to the rider in their gait and their movement when they're not restrained so much, that's the way to tell whether the rider is a skilled, competent rider, is how the horse moves,
how they tone in together.
Yeah.
What I found, most professionals that I met had low back pain, you know, from low back pain to real bad disc pain to actually having had surgeries
because of riding.
And that, you know, this is what happened when we just came out with the product. We had like 10 people come to us, sit in the saddle because they have back problem. This is the only reason they wanted to try to sit in something. And then, you know, they would go away and say, okay, that back pain went away from me sitting in that saddle for 10 minutes. I need to get one of those. That was their only interest. That's the only reason they came to us. Like I said, we had to figure out after what was going on, because it's like you have the both psoas complexes, you know, the back and the front, and then you have the whole spine, and then you have all the muscles and the discs and everything meeting. It's really, really hard if you are, you know, trying to handle forces. I think, like you started off here today, Bradley, you know, you have forces from above and from under coming. And if your body is just, you know, if things are meeting each other in the wrong place, you only get compression. You can't decompress.
Yeah, it's the reason for the conceptual models is to help in those situations to break down very complex issues such as rider issues and you know, rider trauma into an understandable effect of influence and what adjustments need to be done to products. You know, for example, if you've got a rider with a back issue, like a bulging disc, let's just use a bulging disc as an example. You then need to understand where to position that rider because of the bulging disc. Therefore, in certain situations, such as a bulging disc, putting them into a pelvic neutral is not good. You actually need to put them into a slight anterior tilt. because then you're actually inhibiting and closing up that bulge. And this is the reasons why from our perspective, we require the measurements. We require a relatively detailed kind of measuring or diagnostic process, because that is then all taken into account when, for example, we build a product. And
we found a way to find a strange measure that comes into that, and that is the pelvic tilt, the pubic height.
I know what you mean. We do it slightly differently. We take a PSI. I'm going to use some jargon here, but we do PSIS to ASIS to give us a pelvic tilt position. Then we also use ischial width, and then hip width and ischial and iliac crest width as well. We take those kind of 4 measurements and create a pelvic model, and it's quite easy to do that.
Yeah, but there is a way to play with this for people. This was one of my reps that found this. She bought a builder's kit, the little pump with the little bag, because we found that people with a very sensitive issue in their back, that they could actually make themselves sit and find that spot where they were found absolute stability and relaxed, and there was no way I could have found that for them. And now we found that, but we're like, okay, how do we recreate that? That's a different story.
Well, that's the reasons why we created the formula. We created that mathematical algorithm. That's what we've done.
So I'm just before we move on with the slides, I just want to sort of get out of the rabbit hole a little bit, but going back to rigid saddles and flexible saddles, I'd be really interested to know from each of you, given that riders ride in pain and for a variety of reasons, would we prescribe, or what thoughts would you have about them being in a flexible treed saddle and a rigid treed saddle? It's a very broad question, but what's your thought?
I'm going to show you that. I'm going to show you how we do that.
Okay.
With the next couple of slides. So, okay. But I won't answer that because I'll show it in the next couple of slides. But
okay.
Maria,
please do that, because I don't think the saddle can't be too rigid for the rider, and it can't be too rigid. There is you need the motion to be with. So you can't do completely rigid.
Okay. So a quick question from the audience. How do hip injuries, and they mean a torn ligament at the posterior hip joint, so soft tissue injury, how do hip injuries impact on the neutral spine?
Well, it depends on the saddle they're sitting in also. Because why did they have it in the first place? The ones that I see X-rays of are usually quite tight in their angles, in their, there are different angles in the hip, in the femoral head, and some of them are really tight, and some of them have been sitting really wide, and they have just, in the end, one hip is kind of giving up on them, and they've had surgery. So for them, it's been, finding something that doesn't push them apart. You can't be pushed apart. And that's a matter of millimeters.
Yeah.
It's like an absolute point.
I would add to that, of all the templates, the pelvic floor templates, your technique, Maria, that I took at Your Horse Live, and Bradley was with me at the time. I would say the answer to that question lies in get a template and see what the load is, what the load reading is.
Yeah, but the problem is that the template, the template will show you the width between the seat bones, and that will have nothing to do with how wide your hips can be. So when we look at it, we do the template to see, okay, how wide does the seat need to be where your seat bones actually are? And then we see how long are you between the front and the back end. And that will give an indication of how long seat you can have. But if you then also find that you're really round or flat, it will then give an indication of what kind of pommel you can tolerate and need. Because if you're high, you're going to need a pommel up. And then the next thing is, how wide can you sit on that buck? So we change the buck a lot to find out how the hip hinge is, where the leg is really supported but not pushed out.
For me, I was really interested to see those rotations in the load, in the pelvis.
Yeah.
So to answer the question about neutral pelvis and hip joints, I would say make a template and see what's going on in terms of how the rider loads in the neutral pelvis and out of it. So you can get some really good information.
Yeah, in UK, our team, everyone, on the team can do that. So they will find actually access to to any of those reps on the ErgoX2.uk page, because they do seat optimizing only, and they do it without saddles. If you're a couple of people who want to find out what your settings are, you could basically, book for 4 or 5 people and only do that just to find out.
Okay.
And it's normally very interesting.
Yeah.
And surprising.
Every time. So our questioner says that they got thrown riding a racehorse. Ooh, I bet that wasn't the only thing that was sore. Okay, so Bradley, let's go back to your slides.
Okay.
And that was kind of hit.
To quickly kind of just cover the reason, the question in regards to hip injuries of impact neutral spine. We call it HMS pelvis. So we have an analogy for the pelvis, which is the pelvis as a ship. Now, and the spine is the main sail in the middle. Now, imagine the hip and knee injuries and ankle injuries and various things like that as the impact of the sea. So a hip injury will cause the ship to twist and rotate in the water. So imagine if you want, just to help you conceptually understand how the hip injury impacts the pelvis and the spine. Think of it like a ship on a sea, and how a wave coming in from one side with trauma is going to tilt the pelvis in a certain direction to increase load onto another part of the ship. So things like a torn ligament on the posterior part of the hip, that's a really common injury in women. It's more common in women than it is in men. Roughly, it's 60%-ish. I think it's a low 60%. Posterior ligament hip is higher in women than it is in men, and that is because of the width of the pelvis and as what Maria was talking about, the angle of the neck of the femur. So all of that is relatively common in terms of certain gender. How do you get around it? How do you fix it? There's a variety of ways which you can fix it, because not only talking about in terms of saddle positioning, but in terms of width and angles of curves of the seat and so on and so forth. You can also impact it with doing certain rehabilitative exercises, such as getting the glutes stronger and kind of adductors and rebalancing all of those muscles. So that's where it becomes quite fascinating in a situation like that, because you're not just looking at the impact of the saddle, you're also then having to look at the rehabilitative elements of the individual, and you have to kind of go, well, what's your training program? What's this? What's that? So on and so forth.
And this
so
is important.
Situations like that, it's way more complex, and you can't just kind of thing. So yeah, you might end up what you're doing in that situation with a customer with a posterior hip issue, you may end up doing something which is only transitionary for a period of time whilst they are then getting stronger. So then you have to also organize a rental scheme with saddles and various things like that. So
about 50% of the riders that we see have this offset that the pelvis has actually been offset. So they're in a left canter or a right canter.
Absolutely.
And you have one seat bone further out and your pubis is no longer in the middle. The good news is that with good help, with somebody who gives you good reset, has some good knowledge of your ligaments and good knowledge of how to train, you can fairly quickly get back on track with these things. So don't wait. Do it.
Yeah,
it's going to help you.
Because obviously Caroline wants me to crack on. The way I've developed things is we use a scale system of how we monitor and kind of really test the rider. We get the horse and the rider to do certain tests to basically use as a scale to see how strong or weak the rider is. And that then in turn, and as you can see, we've got rider at the top, we've got horse at the bottom, we've got saddle in the middle. So it's obviously representative of what the saddle has to do between the horse and the rider. So this is an oversimplification. I have had to oversimplify it in order to not give away too much of the intellectual property which we have and all of the science and everything behind it. So this is an oversimplification, but it gives you a rough indication of what we do. So in this situation and scenario, we have a very strong rider and we have a weak horse. That indicates to us in terms of a manufacturer that actually we need to build a saddle which is roughly 5 or 6, sorry. Ideally 5, so it's relatively balanced in terms of flexibility and stability. And that we also then, we have caveats which also say in that situation, as the horse gets stronger, then what will happen and what you'll see in the next slide is the flexibility. You can then increase the flexibility of the tree and make it more flexible because you have greater potential because you've got a strong horse and a strong rider. So therefore you can allow, it doesn't matter if you can still give the rider and the horse a stable saddle. You can still give them a rigid structure if you want, or help with their stability. That's not a problem. But you have the ability to make a product which is more flexible because they have the ability to self-stabilize. And this is how we work at Ipotane, is that this is the reasons why we take what we call static measurements. You know, that roughly we take static measurements, and that tells us the static structure of how to build the product. I.e., static measurements tell us how long is the horse's back, right? That tells us how long the saddle needs to be. You know, if we need to know how long the femur is for the rider, how long is the tibia for the rider, how wide is their pelvis, that all sets up the structural components of the saddle. The reasons why we ask for then dynamic measurements of the rider and dynamic measurements of the horse, and they are subjective. You know, you've got to, you try and create systems which are as objective as possible, but they are inherently subjective. You know, there are certain tests which you can do for riders, such as balance tests and core stability tests, you know, such as planks and standing on one leg and kind of doing all like blindfold testing, which gives you a relatively objective way of testing. But when you are looking at the horse, it becomes more subjective because you can't blindfold the horse and suddenly say, right, please horse, can you engage your core? Please horse, can you stand on one leg? Please horse, you can't. So you have to do other tests where a certain element of subjectivity comes in, and that's where the expertise of the saddle fitter really comes into fruition, because that's where, for example, we ask one of our saddle fitters to do a pushback. So we get the horse to basically, we ask them to step backwards, and we get to observe how the horse steps backwards. Is it quite a big stride, or is it short pottery strides? That gives an indication in terms of back elevation and how the horse can lift its back passively without somebody like myself going in and sticking my fingers into its ribs to force it to lift up, because I'm then measuring angles and angles of change and so on and so forth. We also then get the horse to do a lunge. You know, at what angle is the horse kind of leaning in? And we can do that again by getting the horse on the lunge, taking a photograph at a certain point or a video and snapshotting it, and then basically working out the angle of inclination. Now, if we have a horse which is leaning in, now obviously if a horse is belting around, we turn around and say, well, don't take a photograph. There's no point. Do it when the horse is calm and relatively in a normal situation. So that then the fitter can take a photograph, and we can then basically work out the angle of inclination, and that gives an indication in terms of our scale system of how weak that horse is. Because if the horse is leaning in passively on a lunge, it indicates that the horse hasn't got a particularly strong element of self-stabilization. It might be overly reliant on the rider to stabilize. So we use all of these types of things to work it all out. And as I say, that then informs us to not only build then the solid structure, but to then turn around and go, right, how flexible are we making this product, or how rigid are we making the product? And we have ways to do that. And I'll show you later on how we do it and what components. I'll only show it in terms of the equine tree, of what things we can use to make a product stiffer. Now, the reasons why, as I say, we take all the measurements is because we do stuff like this. We work out percentage changes, you know, with an AP, which is an anterior posterior angle. With a lat is the lateral angle, and the TSP angle. So what we do is we take, that's the whole point of why we take these static measurements, is that over a period of time, we can build graphs and we can plot how the horse has changed, both positively and negatively, because you've got to remember is that there's going to be seasonal changes. We've just gone through a period in the UK where it's freezing cold. So a load of horses now are either out in freezing cold weather or they're stabled, and they may not be able to work as much because the arenas are frozen, or they can't go out for hacks. So theoretically, there is a potential for horses' angles and everything to change. And that's not a problem. It's something which can then be measured, calculated, and factored in and for later on, because what we can then do is turn around and go, right, we expect a certain degree of angle change to occur over theoretically a cold spell of a month, and we can factor that in to then forward to our fitters and go, your customers are more than likely going to get a degree change, or 2 degrees change, or 5 degrees change, or whatever. It may be worthwhile going out and seeing your customer base. Here, this is where we kind of say these are the adjustments which we can make to the equine tree. We can change the stiffness of the gullet bar. We can change the position of the gullet bar, point shape, point flexibility, girth strap positioning. We can change the panel materials, under tree materials, tree shape and contour. We can change the stiffness of the panels. All of these accumulatively will increase the stiffness, and we can do that individually depending on, this is where our algorithm and our formula comes into real play, is that we can target areas in order to help. So if we need an area which is an area which is too mobile and needs to be a little bit more rigid, then we can target that specific area. And then here, this is a video of one thing which we do with our points, which is a bit of fun. And it's actually kind of really, it's massively benefiting our customer base. And this is where we were talking about with Maria earlier on about the point length and the point width. You know, we have extremely long points and extremely wide points. That point there is a tree which is a 17.5. So that point, as you can see, is 3.5 inches wide. It's extremely wide. And then the actual point length is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. It's about 6.5, 7 inches long. It's huge. Now the funny part is that because it's so long, we can also then cut the length of it. So if we cut the length of the point, it becomes stiffer. So this is something which we use with dressage horses, and they absolutely love it because they have that that stiffness, and they have that support over the entirety of the shoulder. And what's interesting, as we kind of say that's the fan point or piano key as well, is that the point at the back, the furthest point further away, is actually inherently stiffer than the point at the front. So we have multiple. Think of that point as not just one point. It is now a selection of 3 or 4 different points, and each with a graduation of force or rigidity to it. So as that fan, as the shoulder rotates backwards, the point at the back is then stiffer than the point at the front. And we've designed it that way so that as the shoulder rotates underneath, you have this increase in force, only minor, but to give that stabilization and to stabilize the saddle. But as I say, we can all change all of that. That's the reasons why we spent so long designing it.
It's pretty cool because it moves. You can have that length.
Well, it also means that we can. So when we in our manufacturing, that point is solid, and we have to cut them. Now we can cut the different lengths in order to affect the different stiffnesses. So what we're noticing is actually that point. We may cut the first point really, really high, so it's really, really flexible. But then the point at the back, what we may do is a little cut. And actually that becomes stiffer. So what we do is we almost have like a stepped process of point flexibility going on as well. But we have that ability to do that. And that's why, as I say, you know, just before we started, I'm in the camp of longer points, because if it's too long, it's much easier to reduce. Whilst if it's short enough, if it's too short, you then got to put on things to make it longer or to make it bigger. So we're starting from the perspective of too much and reduce to what is required, rather than build to what is required. If you see what I mean, it's just a different philosophical approach. That's all it is. It doesn't necessarily mean that one is right and one is wrong. It
but you're not you're giving yourself the flexibility in the same tree to do that. And what other fitters are stuck with is that if this tree comes with this point and this one comes with this one, and it's like, well, I wanted that shape of tree for this part of the back, but I needed another point, and then they're stuck.
Yeah. So the whole idea is that we can start off with too much, which is why our manufacturing process is a little bit labor intensive. At the moment, especially considering we're trying to speed up that labor intensive process, because all the calculations, all of the formula, and that's why I ended up creating the formula in order to make the manufacturing process much more accurate.
But this also means you don't really load the point that much. You have decided to load a little bit further back for stability.
Yes, you can. If I use the pointer, you can just see that is where the head plate or the gullet bar would sit, is slightly further back. And that's because of, you know, certain things. But what we can do is we can move that further forward. So we can actually then, and this is why, as I say, we use different tools to create stiff points or loading points in different areas. In this particular case, we have a very, very flexible shoulder because there's an issue with the horse. But in another situation, we may end up putting the gullet bar further forward, and that will then create a little bit more of a stiffness and rigidity over that first and second point. So you can see how we can kind of graduate.
May do when you have a little bit more of a distance or a wider situation.
Yeah. And then, no. Where am I going? Yeah.
Can I just quickly say that in my experience of improving horse performance, it can be a problem if the rider or the horse is less restricted, and the rider can then get a bit of a shock at how the horse moves. Do riders, do they really want horses that perhaps can't move, so that are restricted, or what What will they do when they find the horse is unrestricted and moving normally?
Then they really need to sit in the right place, not to get bounced all over the place, because they're going to wobble all over.
Yes.
So this is just the final slide. So don't worry. I'm not going to waffle on for too much longer. The way I particularly see the industry and see the world is that, you know, we have roughly 3 truths in life. We have our own personal truth, we have our social truth, and we have objective truth. Personal truth is obviously your experiences, is obviously your life, what you know works for you. Social truth is what other people tell you. It's social etiquette. You know, we all know that to a greater and lesser degree, stealing is bad. That's a social truth. But obviously, in certain situations, kind of leniency is allowed. And then objective truth is, it doesn't matter if you burn all the books in the world, it's still true. Gravity still exists. You know, it doesn't matter if you wipe the gravity or the belief of gravity from everybody's mind, it will be rediscovered. It's just it is an objective truth. It exists. Now we have, within the saddle industry and the equine industry, we have a lot which has been based on personal and social truth. We have very little which has been based on objective truth. And I would argue that even the objective process and the objective research which is being done at the moment is slightly perverted, because it has not looked at it from what we call Shoshin, or the beginner's mindset. It is looking at it with an element of personal or social truth, a belief structure that an expert in their field works in a certain way, and that expert has not been questioned. The very fundamentals has not been questioned. You know, as I said earlier about the way pressure pads are put and tested, they're generally put on top of a number between a panel. They're not put direct onto the horse's back with the number on top, then the saddle.
There's another element to that.
Yeah.
I don't know if you have. There are some horses where you can actually get pretty good result if you put double numbness on. They just you got the right angle, but they are slightly slimmer.
Yeah.
When you look at the pressure pad, that is quite a thick thing. It's quite, it's quite substantial.
Yep.
It actually changes everything compared to if you only had the numna there.
Yep.
So, then everyone who's worked with fitting and know that you can put a 2 millimeter shim or a 3 millimeter piece of leather in the right spot, and it changes everything. So as soon as you know that your like the absolute situation is kind of absolute, and you can't get that when you got these pretty thick pads in there.
Yeah,
you will only get
that's also the reasons why we do a lot of our testing on we don't actually do a lot of our testing on horses. We do most of it on mechanical horses, because those are repeatable. We can test it time and time and time and time and time and time and time again. We can have an entire day where the horse doesn't get fatigued because we use a mechanical horse. And we can just sit there and test absolutely everything. That in some regards is the ideal, because you get muscle fatigue over periods of time with pressure mat testing on horses. But the reasons why, that's why, we are, from our perspective, we are looking at trying to be as objective as possible, hence why the requirement for measurements and dynamic measurements and static measurements and so on and so forth. And the reason why is because I'm trying to create the objective truth from my perspective, from the idea of if I can create something which is non-biased, or you're not using my expertise or knowledge and all of that type of stuff, it is just, this is the data. If we have that data collection, that then turns into data. If that data is then turned into information, that information can then be turned into knowledge. And that knowledge is then turned into wisdom. But that is how an objective truth occurs. A personal and social truth is much more based upon experience and interpretation of the information. Data, there's only a limited way of interpreting the data. So that is very much how when we are looking at treed or rigid structures and treeless saddles, because I'm a hybrid manufacturer, I can only talk about it from a hybrid perspective. And because I'm sitting in the middle, I am trying to balance a rigid structure and a flexible structure. And I achieve that by originally starting off with a product which is really flexible, and then using certain components and certain materials in order to help stiffen up the product to a certain degree. And I hope that you can understand now is the reasons why we talk about measuring processes, because we create a scale system which then informs us of the stability. Now, as that scale improves, and as that's kind of you gradually collect more and more data, you can then become more and more detailed in the specific changes or other areas which you can improve. As I said, for example, we didn't realize that even the material which you make the panel out of has an influence of the stiffness of the product overall. You know, whether you cut the leather and the panel from belly, or like the belly part of the hide, or top grain, or the spine kind of zone. So you sit there and kind of, even the detail of the material which you are utilizing to build the top part of the panel has an influence.
Can I tell you that, a story about that, about how you do it? I make saddles in different places.
Yep.
And when we were making them with a new place in Europe, and we sent them the same tree, with the same webbing, with the same foam on, they put their leather on. And because they had a different leather, they pull it harder. The seat ended up completely different shape.
Yep.
Narrower, and only because of the leather and the way they pull the leather on. This is how hard it is to make a saddle. People don't realize.
and even the tanning process. Now, I haven't even gone into the tanning process of how we tan leather. So, and that's the thing, is that there are various mechanisms which we can use in order to adjust a product. And the difficulty is that anybody who comes into the industry, you are starting so far down, and you don't know any of this. You only know this through experience and having a beginner's mindset, and just kind of going, okay, I don't understand how this works. I've got to rip it apart, or I've got to do this, that, and the other. There's no platform, and there's no, as I said, there's no concepts or conceptual model which the industry utilizes. And we need to have these conceptual models, because they're ways to help the industry grow. They're ways to help the individuals understand what manufacturers are trying to do. That's the reasons why it's really frustrating when you're sat there with kind of other industry professionals, and they're talking about, okay, well, what treatment model did you use to treat this horse? What's your philosophical boundaries? Where did you come from? And you're sat there kind of going, well, okay, as a saddle manufacturer or a saddle maker or a saddle fitter, you're sat there kind of going, well, what are my philosophies? What are my belief structures and the models which I use, and so on and so forth? And there's none. And we need to have these kind of deeper philosophical kind of conversations to a degree.
I think you and me might have gone through that. Question to you, and to maybe to the industry: do you think, if you look at your model, what you've done with, because we're pretty similar in our idea about, you have a stability or a movement in the horse, in the saddle, and in the rider. Is there any way that the industry itself could actually start to think about this and actually classify their own products right now? Because it would help the fitters if the fitters were aware that, because some fitters will be aware because they fit a certain brand a lot of times, and they say, oh, this tree is more stable than this one. I can't put this rider on this tree because the horse, they're going to be all over the place. They're going to rotate and be all over. You know, some fitters know this, but I think there's a lot of riders and there are a lot of fitters who don't know these things. Could that be like the first objective of the industry to say, let's talk about if we can classify stability in our products?
Yeah, we do. And not trying to bag, which, you know, everyone's kind of heard me bang, and I'm trying not to repeat that process. But you sit there and go, the only way you can do that is by having a testing procedure. It is the only way you can do that, is that by getting all manufacturers and the industry in a room and going, right, we need to create a classification process. And the classification process is not designed to restrict, it's not designed to inhibit or anything like that. It is designed because the waters are too cloudy, you know, and we need to
basically
help
to get them between 1 and 10. Where are we?
Yeah.
You know, where, you know, is this saddle long or short? Is it stable or unstable?
You know, I ended up writing a whole document about the potential for systematic testing processes in order to create a basically an NCAP safety rating for saddles, from flexible to stable, from grades of materials to weight to performance to pressure math testing, everything. I literally wrote a 40-page document about it all, going through all the testing procedure, the actual materials, the testing equipment you would need, the cost, the value, so on and so forth. I did it all, but like most things, it always falls on deaf ears. But will the industry change? It will do over time, but it isn't going to come necessarily from it will either come from customers demanding it. It will either come from, and I hate to say this, a government influence, i.e. a social influence. So it will be people from outside of the industry suddenly realizing how bad the products are, and that they're not regulated and safety checked and everything like that. And then you've got external pressure being put on, of which you then have no control over. And
it's already put on. But what I'm seeing in the industry is that the fitters are taking the heat for it.
Yeah, exactly. The fitters, as I said last time, the fitters are stuck between a rock and a hard place, because, as I showed last, we push saddles further back, or rigid tree structures further back, in order to avoid the shoulder rotation. But it's a bodge, and the problem is then the poor saddle fitter and the saddle fitter is having to constantly bodge products or adapt products to work, when actually the fundamental change has to occur with the manufacturer or the saddle designer. And that's where the fundamental element of it is. But will there ever be a criteria? Not meaning to sound rude, I sincerely hope there will be. I would suspect that's going to be a personal project of somebody who is far more intelligent than me, who's willing to do that process. I won't be able to do that. I would love to, but I wouldn't be able to do that.
I think it's a bigger project, because it's quite a big ball. Well, it's one that our organizations should have picked up and say,
well, that's the thing. My argument is actually that should come from the organization.
Yes, exactly.
That should come from the governing body. The governing body should be and I'm not trying to bash, I'm really not, but I need to explain that the organization which we have in the UK, which is the Master Saddlers Association, is an organization which has to look after manufacturers, distributors, and fitters. So you've got these three things which they're trying to manage. And the difficulty is that you can't all treat them the same. You can't. You have to. The way you manage a fitting organization is by protecting your fitters, by demanding that products are better, by literally, if you're going to court or a fitter is going to court, you're there. You've got their back. The problem is, as a manufacturer, you kind of want deregulation as much as possible. You don't want to be regulated. You don't want to be controlled. So the problem is you've got a governing body, which is basically an internal battle within itself. It's kind of like, right, we don't want regulation. A manufacturer, if it doesn't have regulation, it can't be held accountable. So in which case it's like, I don't want that. But then fitters are at the other end of the spectrum, which are going, well, actually, we want regulation because we need protection, because we're facing the customers and we're the ones who's potentially being sued. So the problem is you've got a governing body which is trying to achieve two things for two very polar requirements, and it is paralyzed. It is fundamentally paralyzed. And that's where it falls down. And it's a massive shame, because if they were able to segment it for manufacturers, distributors, and fitters, and have regulations and some form of protection, it's very different. And I'm not sure whether one organization can do it.
I think you answered that question, Bradley.
Yeah. Right.
Caroline, there are questions.
You are, Caroline, you were also on mute.
Yeah, my husband keeps saying he wishes I have a mute button. Anyway, and I need one for him too. So a couple of questions. One, I'll ask them both at the same time, because you might be able to, they might be thrown in together. So Bradley, what you haven't clarified is that you actually make a rigid seat as part of your saddle, and yeah. And oh dear. What are your thoughts of inflatable saddles, so the air paneled saddles which have a rigid tree usually?
Right, so air panels are really, really fascinating. I'm probably going to get in some trouble with this.
Rather you than me. Rather you than me.
So what's really fascinating is air does work. It does. You know, it does. But the difficulty is there's a misconception of how air works. People think that if you have air in a bag at a certain volume, let's just say 0.5 of a psi, so half a pound per square inch, and you put a load on it, and that air will then spread. Now, that's true, but the problem is that when you are dealing with air, it is not about the air, it is actually about the material which the air is within. So for example, if you have like a crisp packet and it's then compressed, because the crisp packet is made of a semi or a rigid plastic structure, it's not elasticated. So the problem is that when you push weight down on top of it, the air goes against the rigidity of the material surrounding it, or the plastic bag, and therefore the air pressure, it doesn't increase, but the actual not the density, but the volume actually shrinks, if you see what I mean, because you've compressed it. Now the problem is that if that bag, that plastic bag, you've got the same volume of air, but now in an elasticated bag, and you put load on it, because of the elastic nature of the bag, that load will then push the air out. So you are then spreading that load even further. So when you are looking at airbags or air in saddles, it is less about the air. It is more about the materials which surround the air. Do we understand that? Because
it deforms.
It deforms, it spreads. Now, the real fun part is also that the airbags in a lot of equestrian saddles are adjustable, so they have valves. So there in itself is a weak point. So what commonly happens with airbags is that the valves fail. Now, what you can do is if you had a solid sealed bag, a solid sealed unit, that becomes easier because it's more calculable. It's much easier to predict. Now, what you can do is you can do various other things with air as well.
You do in foam panels. There's a lot of air in foam panels.
Yeah, there's a lot of air in foam panels anyway, but we're specifically talking about those inflatable bags. Now, the other difficulty we have is, this is going into quite a lot of detail about airbags, but it's quite fascinating. A lot of the airbags which are utilized in certain products are two pieces of usually polyethylene plastic, and that's going into a bit too much detail, but they're a certain rigid structure plastic. And what happens is when the bag or the air is inflated and pushed into the bag, they puff up to create now a sausage. So now, in the most polite way possible, you have a sausage bag of air. And what is a sausage? It is a cylindrical structure. Now, again, you've got to then compress that, and that will then spread slightly because it's all down to the volume of air which is within the sausage. Now, if you structured the bag to be potentially either 3-part or even 4-part, the bag and the air will behave slightly differently. If you have, for example, a 4-part bag, okay, so it's like a square, and then you put load on it, you have a flat surface which the load is going on, and then the bulge is going to happen on the side. Do we see what we mean? So this is where it becomes quite fascinating, is that when you're looking at airbags, they work, they really do work, but they can be massively improved. Because you're looking at certain structures and how the air behaves. And the thing is that's where you have to look at the materials, because you can have a solid bag which is pumped full of air and then compressed, and the air is then contained, it's rigid. Or you can have it in an elasticated bag, in which case then the air will move around a lot more free. The difficulty is that when you have an elasticated bag, it creates greater instability. But there are ways to stiffen things up, which I'm not going to give away because that's something which we're playing with at the moment and talking to certain companies about. But the beautiful thing is that air creates depending on what materials you are also using around it as well, because a pure airbag within an entire panel is not conducive, if you see what I mean, because what you've also got to remember is a lot of panels are also wrapped in leather, and because leather is a non-stretchy material, it doesn't matter how elastic your bag is, you're always going to be rigid, be kind of retained by this leather kind of outer paneling, or the leather part. And that's why there's a difference between serge panels and leather panels, because serge panels, because of the weave of serge, and I hope everybody understands what serge is. It's basically kind of a wool. Is that the wool, because of the weave, because it's a crosshatch weave, there will be a slight expansion and contraction. And that's why, as I said earlier, we can change, especially the way we do it, we change the elasticity or the flexibility and the stability of a saddle on like an equestrian part, just by changing the materials which the panel's made up of. So it becomes quite fascinating. And you can go into a lot of detail just on that specific thing.
So with air-flocked saddles, in my experience, the horse absolutely loves them. They're free, or they get more freedom. But from the rider's point of view, they're more difficult to sit in or more difficult to stabilize in. With that, or if the horse is moving well and correctly, they should be easier to sit on.
Personally, the difficulty is when you're looking at, like, let's just look at it from an extreme. You are go to a gym, go to with a gym ball, okay, put a plank of wood on a gym ball, and then try and sit on it. You actually become more unstable because you're sat on top of something. So the way we look at it is this graduation of force. So you have something which is highly mobile, but you can't then have such an extreme rigid structure going from something which is hypermobile to then something the other extreme, which is rigid as hell. All of a sudden, they don't work in sync. So you almost need like a semi-material which goes in between, which kind of acts as a little bit. So you have the rigid structure for the rider, but you then need this kind of semi-flex material in between, and then the airbag. So it acts kind of almost like this dissipation effect coming up through. That works really, really well. But going from one extreme to the other, and that's where things like flare are really, really quite good, because what he's done is he's done that built into the panel. And if you look at the way flares are designed, it is designed so that there is a material, a cushioning material between the airbag and the tree. So a little compensatory thing. So it's very cleverly designed.
Yeah, so he's working up on the stability. I've seen all kinds. When I've met horses that have been absolutely rock hard in the back from using this. And I think that is because it's been too unstable and also moving a little bit too much. People can't always keep track of, we have hot weather, cold weather, air expands, comes back. So it's not as easy to maintain as people may believe. And the horse, if you're coming down and the horse is, having to resist you coming down, it will tense its back more. So really the point of the saddle is for us to stop that force of the puppet coming down too much. And it's finding that it's the right amount of stopping for that weight of the rider, for that strength of the horse. And again, and I think that if we go back to what you've done, Bradley, because you've done a soft under or a flexible under and a sturdier tree, and it comes down to probably where you decided to join them, because you obviously haven't, you don't want to have a joint in the middle, because then your soft tree is going to bend too much. So you thought about where you have, how you've joined them up to remove the middle of the back from having that impact directly, because you don't want your soft tree as to bend in the middle, which is what other treeless saddles will basically do if they're too soft. Are you with me, Caroline? So, if you go back to Mongolian saddles, they're completely hard. They are V-shaped across the back, because that's a very stable thing. And then they put the seat right in the, not in the middle, actually a little bit more forward. And they have their attachment. And I think everyone has to think about, where are we placing the rider? How are we attaching? And how are we stopping that force from going right through? You have done it in your way. The Mongolians did it just the same way as the Western saddles, by building a roof, not coming on close to the spine. So there are so many ways we can avoid getting too close to that spine and creating too much motion close to that spine.
And I'm sure Bradley will be back in a moment. So
You may have died.
bye, Bradley. Thank you.
He'll find whatever things.
Yeah, he'll be back. So what we can take from this basically is that the discussion between the rigid tree and the flexible, or the inflexible versus the flexible, is that the rider's preference is for stability and the horse's preference is for movement. Oh, let me add him back.
No, the horse's preference is to not be disturbed or prohibited or have the rider move all over the place. So the horse really wants the rider to be invisible.
Yes, yes.
That's what the horse likes.
But the horse wants freedom of the scapula. The horse, you know, for the horse to be comfortable, they need to be able to express their gait, and for the rider to ride, they need stability. So
the horse needs that stability. Yes, we have one big cow in the room, or cow on the ice, as we say in Sweden, and that is the horse's rotation.
Yes.
And because we have leverage with our body on the top, you know, especially in the walk, you know, the horse can become a ship, and we will actually take the spine with us and make the horse rotate. So this is why, you know, we need to be as stabilized as we can, saddle and rider, because if we create too much motion, it just becomes very hard for that horse to stabilize their own body.
Okay, so obviously the rigid tree gives us the ability to provide a stable platform for the rider.
Depending on the panel.
Seat. Let me say a rigid seat or some kind of construction in the seat. So what is the application of a flexible saddle? We're all fairly familiar with the rigid tree, but if a rider was to choose a completely flexible saddle, so not a hybrid, completely flexible, and endurance riders are a case in point here.
Endurance riders, I would go the opposite way with endurance riders.
Okay.
Yeah. I would go Mongolian. I would go Western. I would go anything that stabilizes on the sides, gets them off the spine, and keeps them stable, because they are going to be on that horse for hours.
Yeah, their popular choice is for a flexible. I mean, is it? I don't know. Is it because an endurance horse, their weight will, or their body fluids will certainly, their shape, contour will fluctuate. Therefore, it's easier or more convenient.
Or they all ride Arabs, and most of these Arab horses don't fit in any English trees at all.
Okay.
If you're talking about endurance, if you're talking about endurance, then you've also got to understand the main gate which they're going to spend their time in.
Yeah.
Which
and
is
straight.
So it's a 2-time beat. So that will influence in terms of the structure of the saddle as well. You know, you haven't got a 3-time beat or a 4-time. Very rarely are they in a 4-time beat, but or a like walk. They're generally in a 2-time beat. So it makes sense the reasons why they are looking for a tree which is more flexible for the horse, to allow for this dimensional this diagonal movement pattern.
Right.
But
the
difficulty is you've also then got to understand how endurance riders ride. And endurance riders ride very differently, though they spend a vast amount of their time hovering over the saddle. They don't actually sit in the tree. So you if you're looking at endurance, the type of product which you design for endurance, and I'm not trying to kind of point at products which are or anything like that. That's slightly unprofessional if you're not talking about your own. But the one product which works really, really well for endurance is reactor panels. And reactor panels work because of the way they're designed, the knuckle which they've designed. So the panel articulates, and the tree basically sits on top and articulates underneath. The rider, the horse, is just doing a 2-time beat. It's just diagonal, 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 and the rider is then just distributing their weight into their stirrups and kind of hovering. Occasionally they might kind of sit, but they're not distributing. If you look at the stirrups as 2 loading points and the saddle as 1 loading point, so you've got 3 points of contact. They're trying to distribute at least 80% into the stirrups and 20% into the seat. That's what they're trying to do, and you have to design stuff to facilitate that. That's where things like what Caroline said about potentially putting the stirrups into the flaps to load the entirety of the panel rather than a stirrup bar, if you see what I mean. There's loads of designs which you could utilize, and I might be giving away a couple of things.
There are pretty cool Italian designs that do a lot of this. Yeah,
that's what I mean. So you there's a lot of things which are out there which are designed specifically for endurance, and endurance is a just like every discipline is a specialism within itself. You can't, and that's where you can't create a universal protocol for all disciplines. You almost have to create a protocol for dressage, a protocol for jumping, a protocol for endurance, a protocol, because the demands on the horse, the demands on the rider, and the styles which are utilized are so polar different. And that's what I mean. That's the way I look at it in terms of things. Like, irrespective of types of horses or anything like that, it's just like, well, what is the style? What's the discipline? What's the stuff?
So we do need to know more from manufacturers about the benefits of their saddles, not just the features, but they need to be telling us what situations their particular saddles work in.
That means they need to think about that first. And some do. I mean, there are specialists in endurance, for example. There are, I think they're mainly Italian companies have had interest in that. And you look at the racing industry, there are, very, very specialized companies in that. If you look at the jumping industry right now, there are 4 or 5 companies that really focus on the elite jumping. So companies are starting to specialize. It's really just in the dressage end we've gone over the deep end with the big blocks and the
which is there's a question about that. Why are knee blocks so popular in dressage saddles currently? Do we mean fixed or adjustable?
No, the thing is that, if you're not in a seat that allows your thigh to fall down, your thigh is going to start going forward because you're going to roll and your thigh is going to go forward. And even if you are anterior, your thigh is going to go forward because you're going to try to fight falling forward by moving backwards. So then they're all having this idea that they have to sit with their leg under them. So companies started to add knee blocks. And then they also started to figure that they could actually use the knee block. They're actually using it as a leverage.
Yeah.
So in reality, the horse is between the front of the saddle with the knee block and the cantle, because they are now in a posterior position, and the saddle is keeping the leg down. If you took the knee block away, they could not ride with all this strength. and all this power that they're riding now. It would be absolutely impossible. But because the sport has gone towards, power and mobile, and this has created a security for the riders. It's a false security, and it's damaging horses, I would say. But until we actually realize that it is, people are going to keep using them.
It's also one or two other things as well, is that men and women are anatomically different in terms of their leg lengths. So, for example, the way a man's lower leg contacts the horse's rib cage is very different than it is compared to a woman's. So you have literally different positions where the leg is applied. Now, in order to, and I'm going to just run an example, so please don't shoot me for it, but women are stereotypically a little bit weaker than men in terms of their muscular strength. In order to apply the same levels of force, women would typically need to push their legs slightly forward to get a greater leverage, to utilize different sets of muscles. Men can have their legs hanging much straighter to a degree. So we have a gender difference or sexual difference in terms of male and female influences on the application of force. And that in turn informs the block, just as Maria has quite rightly said, is that you've got horses which are extremely powerful, and you need a lot of force to hold them, to keep them relatively contained. So therefore you're using a block as leverage to do that. So there's also a factor of male and female, and that's where now you're starting to get a deviancy within dressage between competition dressage and classical dressage. So you've now got a splitting within the dressage industry from competition and classical. So yeah, you've also got to factor kind of that element of the actual anatomy and the influences of the anatomy onto saddle design and saddle choice and block design, because. And I'm going to say this in a slightly rude way, it is an industry, saddlery is an industry which is predominantly ruled by fashion. It is not ruled by what is necessarily right. And that is because we don't have an objective process or a standard kind of criteria, or as we discussed earlier, this kind of stability rating or any kind of NCAP safety rating. We don't have any of that. And because we don't have any of that, that kind of leads us to be influenced by fashion and pretty and what looks nice and what not necessarily is functional.
And then we have one more thing now, after measuring a couple of thousand riders, that we see, especially in UK, we've seen a lot of it. We have a lot of ladies who do not have the ability to open their thigh as much as the saddles they're sitting on requires. And this means that they would end up, sitting on their ass with their knees pointing out.
Yeah.
So of course, they are going to look for solutions to have, something to save their day. If somebody had told them 15 years ago, oh, this is because your hip hinge isn't open enough for the saddle that you're sitting on. This is not your fault. You don't need a block. Maybe we would, the industry wouldn't have taken that curve to doing that, because we have a lot of men that have more room in their hip hinge.
Absolutely.
Their leg hangs much better. They have an easier time.
Yeah, absolutely. And also the fact that sociologically, we spend more time now sitting in offices than we did 20, 30 odd years ago. So, and if you're spending most of your adult life and, kind of child life in education, which are sat at chairs, which put you in 90-degree positions,
Yeah, and
You know,
posterior.
you go back 20 years, you know, we didn't have so many office workers. We didn't have, now we have more office workers. And okay, now it's even more stay-at-home kind of office workers, which creates another scenario, another issue. But, you know, this is also, we are coming into saddlery from an almost idealized perspective, and we need to look at the sociological element and the sociological influences, the larger sociological influences which affect us. My position is slightly different than Maria's in terms of, if you've got somebody who's an office-based worker who spends most of their time sat in a chair, you know, in an office, and then you're kind of demanding that they've got to be in a certain position, that's a little bit unfair. I understand the principle, I understand the idea, but I look at it from a, well, okay, if you want to put your knee in that position because you're shortened, okay, in an ideal situation, go and do your stretching, go and do your flexibility. But if you've got 2 kids to run around afterwards and a husband, and also you look at your riding, you know, you don't have enough time. So I look at it from the perspective of just going, well, I can, and we'll do what we can do for you. If you can't, or if you want to then go off and do the actual work and do all of that type of stuff, we'll support you through it. But it's just a slightly different way. But as I say, we've also got to look at the larger sociological influences.
And we, something my research is going to show, that we need to look at females who've given birth versus those who have not, those who have been injured giving birth and those who have not. So that's another hand grenade that's going to be thrown in. But I think we do need to summarize now, because you've been very generous again with your time.
Yeah.
But, and there is one question coming through as well, so we'll try and wrap up in the next few minutes. But can you hold on for a second? Sorry. I needed to mute the husband there. Yeah. He's trying to stoke up the fire. So if you're going to have a rigid tree saddle, from my point of view perspective, what I'm hearing from these sessions we've been doing, it must fit the rider, which is obviously your specialism, Maria, and or it must be adjustable for the fitter to be able to make it fit the rider, which is Bradley's specialism.
You must be able to do both. You need to be able to do for both of them.
Both. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And the rider needs to be stable, first, to protect themselves musculoskeletally. We don't want them bouncing and injuring their soft tissue.
Yep.
And also, what was my last point? Anyway, I forget. It's getting late. So how would you summarize rigid? No, that's going to make a long conversation. If somebody came to you and said, I need, my horse cannot have a rigid tree saddle for, you know, they're the wrong shape or whatever. Okay, go off and maybe trim your horse down.
I'll just throw another thing in there. So it kind of depends on the actual shape of the tree that you make and the type of panel that you use. Yeah. So when we use what you guys call a dropped panel, which is a round panel, that panel is a lot thicker in the front and underneath the rider, and it floats. So it kind of makes the saddle more flexible, because you know, you have the rigid tree, you still have to have the right shape, but because you have a thicker panel, it creates that flexibility that you may otherwise get from a plastic tree, where you would then have a plastic tree that gives away a little bit in the rear end or in the front end to create more flexibility. So it's like you have all these 3 layers, you know, the seat layer, the middle layer, and the under layer, and between those you can actually put one more layer.
So it's possible to have a rigid tree saddle that in many ways performs like a flexible saddle, and that's because of the
type of panel you use.
Yeah. Okay. So it's choose wisely. But what riders?
Let's say, wait. I have to put in there. You see, either the English tree is kind of made to fit around the front, and then you have quite a thin panel in the middle. That's usually thin, both width-wise and thickness-wise, and then you have the gusset in the end. So you have 2 triangles in the back end and 2 triangles in the front end, and the saddle is then balanced between those 4. That is, a typical English gusseted saddle. So the problem with that is if you have then a really short horse with a little bit more curve, or with another type of curvature than that particular tree. And that's when you get into a problem with a rigid tree a lot of the time. What you can do with that saddle is fit on a very straight back and a horse that might not be so wide in the front, because the saddle is going to sit stable.
Yeah.
So that's why a lot of people like putting it on there, because it's going to sit there stable. When you go to my type of fitting, when you do a shorter tree, that you don't have big gussets in the back end, and you have a wider, softer area in the middle, I really need to fit width along, and I need to be much more exact to the horse's tilting of the back.
Yeah.
Because I'm not going to be able to stuff more in the front and the end to balance that saddle, because I don't have that.
Okay.
And then we come to Bradley, what he's doing. He's not depending on any of these things, because he can make his tree move in this ends as long as he puts the stability so it doesn't collapse or start twisting in the middle. You see what I mean? And then you have soft trees that do twist in the middle. So we have all these versions out there.
But to me, very quickly, before I let Bradley round up, I keep going on about English trees not perhaps being wide enough, but it could be that riders who prefer the treeless or flexible, they're actually getting good stability from the width of being able to contact the horse more. So that could be an advantage for those who need more width in their saddle tree, which is not provided in some designs.
No, I think it's as easy as when you look at the so-called yew trees or hop trees, when we've looked at them, they're actually wider in the angle at the very front than they are at the base of the wither, because of the design of the rails. I have not yet to meet a horse that is narrower at the base of the withers than behind the shoulders. So what the problem you're having is actually right underneath the, where the rider sits at the rail, where the stirrup bar is, where you load it. Because if you have the horse here, you have to have the same angle of things here. Otherwise, it's going to sit, on top, and it's going to move, and it's going to choose one side. And of course, you have loads of riders out there who've tried to put saddles on, to a wide cob. You've got loads of cobs or a really short horse. And because they can't find a stabilized place, of course, they would go to a treeless saddle, because that's going to adapt to that. So, very often it's a tree-shaped flaw.
Yeah.
But the thing is like a hoop tree is where you're absolutely right, Maria, where it goes narrower and the angle is slightly narrower behind the thing. That was designed not for the horse. That was designed for the rider's perspective.
Yeah, to not spread them.
So that's where you have to kind of almost caveat into that discussion, is that you turn around and go, a hoop tree was originally designed to try and marry the two elements of the horse and the rider, and the only way it could do that by that design was actually making it narrower in the twist zone just behind the wither, to accommodate for the rider. So we also have to kind of remember is the difficulty is with treed saddles or rigid structure saddles is you can design a product which might work for the horse, but it may not work for that particular rider.
Yeah, exactly.
And that's always the fundamental issue. You're always going to have that. And you're absolutely right. It depends on the tree, but the problem is then you are going to potentially have 2 or 3 trees, depending on the individual horse, the individual rider, the season, is it summer or winter, whether the horse is in full-time work or in reduced work. So all of a sudden you've now sat there kind of going, well, actually I need this hoop tree here, but I need a straight one when it's in work. And that's the fundamental problem is you're always having to compensate.
I think there's what I see, because I worked with a lot of trees that are from other parts of Europe.
Yeah.
And when you do that, you normally have the curve. There's more curvature in them. And if you, like the English say, if you do put them too far up on the head, they are going to be too tight in between. If you, on the other hand, decide not to do that, to put them further apart, you can actually have the width and still get wider here without pushing the rider out that much. And you can also control where you want the width of the seat, because the wider seat part of
that will also affect the twist of the wood.
Yeah, and
exactly.
the widest. So it's
so
very,
and that's what I mean is the twist of the wood is what is the biggest issue, not necessarily how narrow and how close the parts are, but it's also about the way the twist is, the twisting of the wood. The reason for the hoop, and I'm not an advocate for hoops, but I understand their design, is that the hoop is designed to try and mitigate by coming so close together. Is trying to mitigate the effect of the angle. If you go wider, then the angle has a greater influence upon the rider. So you can understand their design, but
it doesn't work.
Well, yeah, and the problem is it does work, but it doesn't work. If you see what I mean. So it works for riders particularly well, but it's not particularly brilliant for horses. But that's also, it's a catch-22, because it's also why a lot of horses change, and they are transitional. And again, that goes back to the fundamental problem is that when you have a solid structure tree, you're at the whim of the development of the horse and the development of the rider.
Yeah, you have to have systems. I mean, we see that a horse that develops into a sound individual, if you put that way, the difference between the first measurement that you do behind the shoulders to the base of the withers will have between 15 to 20 degrees. If you have less than that or more than that, you usually have problems in the top line. But it means that as a saddle designer, I need to be able, just like you say, Bradley, to go in and work with that tree, tweak that tree, work on the underside towards the horse to be able to say that, okay, this horse is now a little bit too narrow underneath the stirrup bars, or it's a little bit too narrow right in the front of the tree, but it's quite wide underneath where the stirrup bars are. And that means that I, as a fitter, I need to be able to get it right in whatever area. And I need that to be adjustable quite quickly and easily. So I need to be able to keep track of that, like you say, objectively, and say, okay, what is going on with this horse? How often do we need to see it? And do I need to have tools with you and to have, because it could happen in 2 weeks. depending on the, or it could happen in 2 months, depending on what is going on in the life with that rider and that horse. And we really need tools to say, okay, what's going to happen? And like you're saying, you might not need to get as close because you don't have a rigid tree. So that makes it easier, and that makes it understandable why people are going to flexible things, because they don't have time to get that close. So now we're saying that, okay, we may have competitive people who are used to having somebody out there, boom, boom, boom. And then we have people that remember, 2 years later that, oh, I haven't had my saddle fixed. We're not all equal. We're not doing the same thing with our horses.
Yeah.
So the choice comes down to, who are you? What kind of horse are you riding? What are you expecting to do with it? And what's your situation right now?
Which I'm planning for the next summit, although I don't know if there's a part 4 to this one. Maybe there is. But I want to get into the fitting protocol, i.e. what systems do we need for fitters to go out? What sort of information do they need? What should they be looking at? What should they be referring? Blah, blah. So that the saddle works the best it can for the horse and the rider, and for the fitter too.
You see, I'm sure,
but
Caroline,
not now.
No. But it's the one thing I've always found fascinating within the industry is that we have specialist products. We have a dressage saddle, we have an endurance saddle, we have a jumping saddle, blah, 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 blah. But there is no qualification for a specialist saddle fitter for endurance, for pregnant women, for children, for disabled, for... It boggles my mind that we don't have subspecialisms within saddle fitting, where you sit there and, like, I'm an osteopath, but I've also got a subspecialism within sports injuries, or I've got a specialism within children, or a specialism within craniosacral, or whatever. We have that as in terms of a therapeutic approach. You can have your global qualification, which shows that you are certified, you are safe, you are regulated, blah, blah, blah. But I've never understood the sheer kind of just, you should have a specialist in pregnancy or post-pregnancy. If you are going to have a saddle fitted and you are of childbearing age, and you sit and go, I plan on having kids in the next 5 years, 10 years, sit and go, right, pre, during, post, you can have a protocol for that, because we know that that's almost like a standard process. Pre, you're trying to conceive, you might go through fertility, IVF, or various things like that. Once you are pregnant, you can then, that's a process in itself, right? Okay, you've got to have your saddle fitted, relaxin levels are increasing, yada yada yada. Post pregnancy, you've given birth, depending on how you've given birth. I don't understand how that is not a specialist saddle fitting expertise, and that's not a qualification in upon itself. It
will be when my research comes out.
It's very special. It is very special. I mean, we will have people contact us that are 4 or 5 months pregnant, and they're like, oh, I want to fit a saddle now, and we'll go, or can somebody else ride that saddle, and we're like, wait.
I don't understand why there aren't kind of CPD courses which allows a fitter to become more qualified in a specialist field, such as pregnancy or or disabled or children or various things like that. I'm kind of like, those are like, that's your demographic. That's who you're going to. Like, I don't get it.
It kind of gets worse than that. It's like, are you a really short rider? Are you a really tall rider? We have tall riders don't necessarily have a big bum, right? They are very tall. And they are given seats only according to their legs. And they're all over the place. And then we may have a person who's short and they happen to have it looks like they have a big bum. It's mostly just fluff. They have a small pelvis. So they've been given this huge saddle that they're all over the place like a boat. Because nobody have no idea where their bony structures are. And it's only by actually listening to the customer telling you what they're experiencing that you can learn and say, oh, that's interesting. What do you say happened? And then you have to explore with that customer what is going on here? Where you're not getting the support? Where are you ending up? What are you feeling you have to do with your body? There's so much exploring you can do, but if you follow the rules, I think there are rules there. People like to be the expert, and they may not learn that you can go out there and say, I'm going to learn something from you today. This is going to be an adventure. We kind of have to change our attitude. We can't go out there with the Bible and say, this is what I'm going to do. We have to kind of go out there with a very open mind, and then some physical protocols, that we can follow, to hold on to, because we are learning all the time, just with having that mindset.
Yeah. I think, I've just to finish off, really, a lot of excellent fitters with lots of experience are leaving fitting. Yeah. And I hope that we can get them back with your idea of being specialists, Bradley. And, so it's just to show them there is a space for those who...
No, their problem isn't that. Their problem is like for the teachers. They're being abused from both ends. And this is the good people just they try so hard. These fitters try so hard to do the right thing.
Yeah.
And in the end, they get abused, because when you stretch, we've done it a lot in this company. When you stretch all you can to help someone, sometimes you break.
Yep.
You don't end up actually being able to do that last twist or whatever it is.
Yeah.
So you will take a lot of grief from the customer who expected you to do the almost impossible. And you will also take a lot of financial hit for trying to do that, because you may have produced 1 or 2 saddles and tweaked them and done all sorts of things, putting a lot of money and time into that. And, the manufacturer and whatever you have resources together, you can't get it done. So you're taking economical hit, and you're taking a hit from the customer. And there are only so many times good people can stand doing that.
Yeah.
And this is why they leave.
So they need a lot of support, and the education has to come through.
Yes.
So we're getting there.
Being empowered from both ends, these fitters.
Yeah.
Because otherwise we will only be stuck with those, who like to sell expensive stuff and then don't answer the phone. We can't have that. We can't have the industry only going in that direction.
No. Oh, right. Another marathon session. One comment. It's not a question. It's a comment. I ride in a passier zone with a very shallow open seat. And I find if I sit up at the front of the movement, I can manage a big moving trot. Oh, can you send a video, please? I'd love to have a visual on that. And she also says, you're all wonderful to listen to. Thank you.
Thank you.
So if you have no more comments, or if you have a parting word, speak now. If not, we will...
I think you're right. I should shut up.
No, I'm seeing some solutions here for the future, and we're really getting to the nitty-gritty of what's needed. So we will talk about protocol. That'll be about six parts, I think.
I think honestly, if you created a protocol for it's almost impossible to create a protocol unless you have as I said, you can't create a protocol unless you have a conceptual model which you are working from or anything from. It's easier to create a protocol for a process, if you see what I mean, or something like pregnancy. You sit there and go, there's a beginning, there's a middle, and there's an end. No matter where you start, there's a process, so you can do that. Something like children, you can do that. You can do a protocol for children, and at certain stages you can do a protocol for high performance individuals. You can do a protocol, but you'd have to break it down into subcategories. You can't create, and I mean this the most polite way possible, but you cannot create a protocol for a generality, if you see what I mean, because there's too much variance. You would have somebody like me who's 120 kilos, 6'5", and you have to create a protocol which is not only going to suit my style of riding, my physical structure, but also then somebody who is 5'1", half my body weight and then some, and all of that. You can't create a protocol for that extreme. You almost create a protocol for that specialist group, and I think that can be achieved, but again, you would have slightly different conceptual models for those, just like what we do in therapy. If I'm going off and treating a child, I cannot have a certain conceptual model in my head treating a 3-year-old child than I would do treating a 30-year-old man. So, and that's what I mean is you have to. I'm a big one for trying to create conceptual models and then protocols off that, because it gives you a layer of protection. So that's quite good fun.
I think we have probably like a 5 or 6 step protocol, but then when it comes into these special situations, what we always have is that we connect maybe one more person, another set of eyes, another that we don't leave that fitter to make all those calls that they may not be experienced to do themselves. So part of our protocol is like a backup of what pictures, what are we experiencing, what's going on. Part of our protocol is actually sometimes that we go on video direct with the fitter when we know we have a very, very tricky situation. We had that yesterday. We had a lady who had 21 centimeters between her seat bones. Never heard of. And she was wide, and then she had a very, very stressed Spanish or Portuguese horse that she'd not been able to canter. And that was very high in the front and then dropping in the rear. We had little pieces of pads all over on her just to stabilize her. Once I'd helped them with that, they went off and they trotted and they cantered and they did all sorts of stuff. The horse looked completely different and the lady was happy after. But there was no way a fitter would have had a protocol to do all those things for that situation. You have to kind of work together and say, okay, now where did we end up here?
I think what I have in mind is what information do saddle fitters need? What questions do they need to ask? Where are the knowledge gaps? So that maybe one day
I think it's normally actually in the booking. They know too little about the customer when they get out there. That's a big problem.
So let's leave it there. We've had, thank you all, very interesting. Many thanks, Bradley, Caroline and Maria. Fascinating and a smiley. Really looking forward to fitting protocols. Right then.
Okay.
So so if anyone has any questions, just put them in the forum somewhere, in Learn Saddle Fitting forum, and we can continue this discussion if you've still got more to talk about, rigid versus flexible. But I think yeah, we've certainly opened up the discussion about them, and I've certainly learned more about what would work for some, or why it works for some and not others. So especially for the endurance riders. So fantastic. So thank you everybody for listening, and we will let you know when the next summit is, which will be probably next month. And we look forward to seeing you all again. Thank you.
Good night. Bye-bye.
Good night.
Ooh.